Great. Everybody turn your microphones on to the green. In accordance with Section 5 of the Open Public Meetings Act, Chapter 231, Public Law 1975, be advised that notice of this meeting was made by posting on the bulletin board, town hall, and mailing to the officially designated newspapers a list of the meeting dates annually, indicating that this meeting would take place at Milburn Town Hall at 7:30 p.m. on Wednesday, January 18th, 2023. Roll call.
Allison Canfield. Here. Michael Cohen.
Here.
Maggie Miggins.
Here.
Deborah Neves.
Here.
Sujata Shan.
Here.
Srini Vijay.
Here.
David Cosgrove.
Here.
Vice Chair Gaston Halbert.
Here.
Chair Deb Zoll.
Here. Our first order of business tonight is the approval of the minutes of January 4th, 2023. They were sent around by email distribution for review. They were brief, as our meeting was brief. Did anybody have any comments or corrections to the meeting minutes? Do we have a motion to approve?
Motion.
A second? Second by Deborah. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? No abstain. Okay, meeting minutes of January 4th, 2023 are approved. We have one memorializing resolution, and that was per the action taken at the January 4th Planning Board meeting. The resolution of the Planning Board approval for professional services, wherein we chose to retain Mr. Buzak as our Planning Board attorney. I will move to approve that resolution. Second? Second. Thank you, Allison. All in favor? Can we do it all in favor, or is that
Can we do a
a?
roll call or?
I just do a roll call
Okay,
because of
thank
the funding.
Allison Canfield.
Yes.
Michael Cohen.
Yes.
Maggie Miggins.
Yes.
Deborah Neves.
Yes.
Sujata Shan.
Yes.
Srini Vijay.
Yes.
David Cosgrove.
Do I vote on this or?
Yes.
No.
Gaston Halbert.
Yes.
Deb Zoll.
Yes. Great. Resolution from January 4th approved. No applications are on the schedule for this evening, but we do have our one order of business that we briefly alluded to last week, last meeting, apologies, and we have the benefit of our board planner, Graham Petto, with us this evening. Welcome, Graham, to introduce, provide some background for us, and then we as the board will have a discussion regarding the historic element of the master plan subcommittee review.
Okay.
Is Graham in a place that he can be heard and or seen by however this is being recorded? Okay. Just wanted to double jump in. Thanks.
Can you do this?
You can do it. Okay, great.
Can you do it? Wait,
I forget.
Okay.
Surprise you.
Nice for you. And you can do it. All right, well, good evening, everybody. Graham Petto, serve as the board planner. I'm the principal of topology. It's nice to see everybody in person. It's my first time in person with you all, so I'm happy to be here. And I want to thank you all for the opportunity to work with you again this year. We're looking forward to a good year ahead. So I did have the benefit of watching your last meeting, but for a little bit of a preview of tonight's discussion. From the sound of a lot of things and talking with a lot of different folks and the subcommittee and working with them, I thought that it would be very important and beneficial for us to do a little bit of a discussion about historic preservation planning and what we're doing here, and how this fits in with your statutory responsibility, and how this also nests with other components of zoning and land use administration here in the township. So I put together a little bit of a presentation that we're going to walk through. There is a lot of narrative text in it. However, a lot of it is just copied straight from state statute. I wanted to make sure that I just gave you the state statute to read right out of the municipal land use. So I feel like that's the best way to do it. I've highlighted certain sentences and sections. So if it's okay, I'd like to go through and walk you guys through this evening. Okay.
Yeah.
And Eileen has shared this also on the screen as well. And I'll be sure to, this can be sent out to anybody or made available to the public as well. I think that might be helpful for them. Okay. All right. So the next page. May have to go up. There you go. Perfect. All right. So first, I just wanted to touch on, where does the power come to the board with respect to its responsibility for the master plan? So in NJSA 40:55D-25 sets forth the powers of this body, of the planning board. And as you'll note, number 1 is the master plan pursuant to Article 3 of this article. So that is your primary and first responsibility listed within the municipal land use law, is the master plan. You'll see there are 5 other responsibilities listed there, which you're all pretty familiar with: subdivision and site plan review, other things such as the official map, zoning ordinance, capital improvement program, and then variances in certain building permits, which are part of a site plan review component. So you'll see that number 1 is the master plan. So that is, what we're discussing with respect to the master plan element. Next slide. Thanks. Okay, so here I just wanted to kind of demonstrate, how does this all fit together? What is the relationship between the master plan, ordinances, and how that gets administered here in the township? And what is the relationship between this body, the township committee, and the municipal staff that kind of steward and oversee implementation of these different components? So the first on the left, you'll see we have the planning board. And the planning board, as we just noted, its primary responsibility is to prepare, adopt, and amend. You'll see the master plan and component elements. So that is the planning board is the sole adjudicator of the master plan. They're the sole entity in the township that's responsible for this document and the component elements. Next column, you'll see we have the township committee. The township committee is responsible for adopting and amending ordinances and zoning ordinances. So you'll see below that zoning and land use ordinances and regulations. Those are adopted and administered by the township committee. And then between master plan component elements and zoning and land use ordinances and regulations, you'll notice a 2-way arrow. And that's what you all are pretty familiar with. When ordinances come to you for consistency review, is this body's responsibility to review pending ordinances introduced and proposed by the township committee, and to look at your master plan and say, is this consistent? Is this what we talked about? Is this what we contemplated when we were planning for these types of modifications and changes? So that's where that consistency review double 2-way arrow kind of comes into play. From there, zoning ordinances and regulations are the statutory basis for decision-making by the building department, the zoning officer, and other folks that are responsible for land use administration and approvals. So that's what they have to base their decisions on, those zoning ordinances and regulations. So I thought this was a way to kind of show you all how it all fits together, and show you that the master plan is an important component of this. It does kind of provide the basis for everything that happens as we move along the chart. Next slide. Okay, so now what I wanted to do is break this into pieces. So first is the planning board master plan responsibilities. So as I noted in the power section, it says the planning board is responsible for the master plan pursuant to Article 3. This is Article 3. This is that section that is referring to. So it says preparation, contents, and modification of the master plan. The planning board may prepare and, after public hearing, adopt or amend a master plan or component parts thereof to guide the use of lands within the municipality in a manner which protects public health, safety, and promotes general welfare. And then the master plan talks about different sections and different component requirements. So that's in subsection B. The master plan generally comprises a report or statement and land use and development proposals with maps, diagrams, and text, presenting at least the following elements 1 and 2, which is your primary required elements, and then where appropriate, optional elements, which are listed 3 through 17. And number 10 is the item that we're talking about. Number 10 is the historic preservation plan element. So it's important to note this is an optional element. This is not a required component, but it is an important element. This does advance the general welfare of the township, protects and stewards historic resources. So this is definitely an important component. Many communities across the state have adopted historic preservation plan elements. This township, in fact, already did in 1991. And so we are just updating that existing element. And then sub to this, you'll see there are 3 required components of a historic preservation plan element. The first is that they have to indicate the location and significance of historic sites and districts. The second is that it needs to identify the standards used to assess worthiness for historic sites or district identification. And third, it needs to analyze the impact of each component and element of the master plan on the preservation of historic sites and districts. So those are that's what the historic preservation plan element has to do per state law. So on the next slide, I went through and kind of did a little bit of a brief consistency review. Does the master plan element that we do have before you that's been prepared by the HPC do those 3 things? And the answer is yes. And we'll talk through, where each of those things lives within the draft. We have a photo of the cover of the proposed master plan that has been referred over from the HPC. So the first one, indicate the location and significance of historic sites and districts. That is contained within section 6, inventory of historic resources in Milburn. That's listed on pages 39 through 68 of the draft plan. The second is identifying the standards used to assess worthiness for historic site or district identification. That's contained within section 4.4.1, the criteria for determining local significance. And in this draft plan, it refers to the National Park Service, the national standards for criteria for determining what's significant. And examples of those things are, is the site or the property associated with somebody who had a significant role in the township's history? Was the building or the physical or the site developed by someone famous, or an architect or builder, a master worker, or craftsman? There's different criteria components. Those are some examples of some that can be used. And then the third is analyzing the impact of each component and element of the master plan on the preservation of historic sites and districts. And this draft plan before you does that in 3 different sections. Section 5.5.1, it talks about its relationship with the land use element. 5.5.2, circulation. And 5.5.3 talks about its relationship with the green building and environmental sustainability plan. Okay, any questions so far? I know I've given a lot of information. So, yes.
One question on the slide, the 2 slides prior when you talked about
Sure.
the planning board, the
Yeah, the
DC,
relationship. Yeah, we can
the
certainly jump
zones.
back.
Are you going to touch on where the historic commission falls within sort of?
I will with respect to the land use approval review
Mhm.
part. So that is coming
Okay.
towards the end. So.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
Yep, there it comes.
Okay, yes, so next. So the next part, in thinking about moving across our chart is how does the historic preservation plan and the master plan inform the zoning ordinance? And so in 40:55D-65.1, the municipal land use law says that the zoning ordinance may designate, regulate historic sites and districts. So we are allowed to use zoning as a tool to help protect or conserve historic resources within the township. And there's a couple of different, there's 5 different items here that I'll read through quickly. So the first is the zoning ordinance may designate and regulate historic sites or districts and provide design criteria and guidelines therefore. Designation and regulation pursuant to this section shall be in addition to such designation and regulation as the zoning ordinance may otherwise require. Meaning, if it's in the R1 zone, that stays, and this historic designation is on top of that. You're not superseding or taking away the R1 zoning, and this is almost an overlay for functional terms. The third one here, this is the one that's most applicable here within the township, is because our master plan element will be adopted after July 1st, 1994. It says all historic sites and historic districts designated in the zoning ordinance shall be based on identifications made in the historic preservation plan element. Meaning you can't pick another house or pick another property that's not identified or listed within the preservation plan element here that we're contemplating, okay? So that's why this plan is important in that it's setting forth, a program for historic preservation or a plan to complete historic preservation. Then it talks about prior to 1994, such designations were able to be made on other elements, didn't just have to be the historic preservation plan, but that's no longer the case for this body at this time. And then this last point is very important to note. The governing body kind of has the ability to jump the line a little bit, where it says the governing body may at any time adopt by affirmative vote of the majority of its authorized membership a zoning ordinance designating one or more historic sites or districts that are not based on identification within the historic preservation plan. So that's important for you all to know that can still happen. That would obviously be an ordinance that would be referred here for consistency review. Would give this body the opportunity to say, hey, governing body, this actually isn't in the plan. So you would be able to make that recommendation back. So all these component pieces work in tandem to kind of inform the process and make sure everybody understands things. And again, I want to just reference that this piece, this zoning ordinance piece, this is separate and apart from the plan element that we're talking about. They are inherently related in that they'll guide and advise policy development as it goes forward. But at this time, this body, in acting on the preservation plan element, is not doing any of those functional changes to the zoning ordinance. This body's not empowered to do that. So none of these properties that are contemplated in the plan would be subject to designation automatically. They would still have to go through a process where the TC would have to draft an ordinance, refer it to this body, and then adopt it on public hearing. Okay. Any questions on that piece? No? Okay. Okay, so next, what I wanted to do now is talk through how does the designation process even happen? It sounds based on the prior slide that, oh, the TC just needs to sit down and write an ordinance and then send it here, that's it. That is not the case. And your ordinance is like many others throughout the state where there's a clear designation process outlined. And I have that up here on the screen on this slide. And on the electronic version, that's a link. So if you click it, it takes you right into your E-code. You can see it all for yourself if you want to see it within the text. And I've kind of summarized some sections, so it doesn't line up nicely, but I've wanted to just list out the steps essentially so you could kind of see the flow of the process. So before any property can be encumbered by historic zoning, the first is that the site or district must be identified, and it must meet that criteria for designation. And then a nomination report needs to be prepared. And the nomination and the preparation of the report can only be done by 3 bodies here within the township committee, the HPC, or this board are the only ones that can initiate a designation of a property as historic. That's it. Nobody else is empowered. Your neighbor can't come out of the blue and want to designate your house. The Historic Society or other entities within the township are not empowered to do that. They can certainly ask this board, they can ask the township committee, they can ask the HPC. But it's only those 3 bodies that can do this. And there's 2 sub-criteria that I wanted to highlight. So the first is the site or district must meet at least one of, there's 8 different defined criteria within the ordinance. That's where I was talking about, it needs to be associated with a person, or it has to be associated with a famous architect. There's 8 different stipulations that it has to meet at least one of those. And as I mentioned, those are consistent with the National Register criteria. Second is the site must be identified within the historic preservation plan element. Again, you can't pick a property that's not within this plan that we're discussing this evening. Second, after the nomination report is prepared and written, and the nomination report has a whole series of requirements too, it has to include photographs, has to include a narrative history of the property, all types of things. Next is a public hearing. And the public hearing is held before the Historic Preservation Commission. 20 days of public notice is required by certified mail to the property owner. And they have to receive correspondence that explains the designation, explains the significance and the consequences of the designation. This is all written in your ordinance. So it's very clear that the property owner must be fully advised of what this action means for them. There also must be public notice published in the official newspaper. And the report needs to be made available for public inspection. So the public has to have the opportunity for a full 20 days to read the report, know what this means, and know what's happening. Okay. Next is the HPC holds their public hearing. They review the proposed nomination, and they make a decision. And if approved by the HPC, then the HPC prepares a commission report on the nomination, and they send that to the TC, to the governing body. They say, we've reviewed this nomination, we are in favor, we recommend that this be advanced for nomination and designation. The township committee then receives the HPC reports, both the nomination report and their commission report, and then they prepare and introduce a zoning ordinance. Now, they're not acting on this, but they're just following the steps. They put together a zoning ordinance, they say this is what the HPC wants, or this is what the planning board, whoever initiated the process. For amendment for the site or historic district, and then they send that ordinance, the draft ordinance, the nomination report, and the commission report to this body, the planning board. And then this is your old consistency review. So this is the time where the planning board would sit down and go through all those documents and say, is this consistent with the plan element that we had adopted way back? And make a determination on that consistency. Then this body sends it back to the planning board with a report on the consistency, or back to the township committee, I apologize. And then it's the township committee's second action. And again, ordinances on second read, that's a public hearing. That's again when members of the public can come, provide their comments at the TC, as the TC members here know. And then the township committee has the ability to either approve it, reject it, or modify the proposed ordinance and use the advice from the planning board. Okay. So I just wanted to note that this is all existing requirements. The historic preservation plan element isn't contemplated to change any of this. And I wanted to talk through this sequential process so everybody here understood that taking action on the plan element doesn't designate anybody. There is still a whole subsequent process that is set forth in the ordinance and requires a series of steps for the property owners to understand both the significance and the consequences of such designation. So happy to answer any questions.
So the property owners who are being noticed would be noticed for each step of this, so they would get, like 4 different notices based on every time it comes up before it.
Yes, so the primary notification requirement, I have to look in the code in detail, but the primary one is the first one, is the HPC step. That's where it talks about a correspondence need to be sent that includes the significance and consequences and, what this all means and a copy of the report. The subsequent ones, I'd have to confirm whether it's in there, but that's something that we could even contemplate as an amendment to the plan element saying that notice should be provided at more steps. That's something that we could think about.
Okay.
But I can get that clarification specifically of what it says in the ordinance.
Okay.
And I had a question,
Sure.
1B, which you've highlighted in terms of the site or district must be identified in the element, except in the case of the exemption, if the township committee
Correct.
decides that they would like to take action.
Correct.
If it's that situation where the TC is going to take action, would they then have to go through subsequent steps, or could they?
That is a really good question. And I don't want to.
Just curious, I mean, that's not what we're contemplating here tonight, I understand that, but I
But
just wanted to
I think
understand.
that is an important question. I can certainly get an
Okay.
answer on that. Yeah, because the way that it's written in the municipal land use law kind of gives the governing body a separate power and
Understood.
enables them a separate role to do
Right.
that. I'd have to look at that
Okay.
relationship.
Thank you. Any other questions for Grant?
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, next slide. This slide is very important, and I wanted to talk through this process with you all. It's titled Advisory Referral of Applications for Development to the Historic Preservation Commission. So it's important for you all to understand, this is within DRZ, this is your code that we're talking about, 806. And this is all in accordance with municipal land use law, 40:55B-110. In this section of the municipal land use law, and also here within the Millburn Code, it states that the Planning Board and Zoning Board of Adjustment of the Township of Millburn shall refer to the Historic Preservation Commission every application for development submitted to either board for development involving historic landmarks or properties located within historic districts identified in the township's historic preservation element of the master plan. So I wanted to just make reference to this. So this is anyone that's identified within the historic preservation plan element is subject to this referral requirement.
As I say, if you just take 3 steps back, there you go. Thank you. Dance while you do it. Thanks.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
So we already, you said in 1991, we had this done.
Mhm.
We haven't updated it since then. So does that mean that anybody that is currently in his, should have always go in front of the HPC?
That's
If
correct.
they've been cited in the master plan, although they haven't been designated yet?
Correct.
So anyone that's cited. So if there's buildings that have come down that have been cited in the master plan already, and they shouldn't have come down, then is what we're hearing, right? If they're already from, I'm saying we only have the 1991.
Yes, so that kind of gets into the jurisdictional review and the level of review that's afforded in section B, which I was about to read into. So
Okay.
I just want to make reference to that.
Good.
Yes,
I'm also kind of piggybacking on that because it says the planning board and the zoning board of adjustment shall refer.
Mhm.
So that would only mean matters that are coming before them.
correct.
So if we have a property that's in the master plan listed as whatever,
Mhm.
and it comes in for a building permit that
Mhm.
requires no board action, that.
It's not subject to review.
Okay.
Yep, only once it's designated and goes through that process would it be subject to review. Yeah, so it's important to distinguish anybody seeking to do what we call by right modifications to their house and they're listed within the plan element, they can continue to make by right changes. If they want to apply for demolition permit, they can do that. I mean, they don't need board approval to demolish a house.
Even if it's in this 1991
That's
plan.
correct. That's correct. It's only when there's a development application. And the way the municipal land use law contemplates this is an application for development coming to this body represents a significant change to a property. There's either a site plan at this board or a variance requested at the zoning board. There's a change that's happening to the property. So this section creates a referral process to say, oh, this is in the master plan. The HPC, the township has identified this as something to think about preserving, and they send it to the HPC for advice, which is in section B. Decision of the commission is advisory only. So they say, HPC, please tell us about this change. Is this consequential? Is this going to impact the property? And that's where the HPC is afforded the opportunity to give a report to the zoning board or to this body on those changes and
So
the impacts.
why would I want to why wouldn't I just tear it down and then go to the planning board?
And there are cases where that does happen.
How is demolition not considered a significant event?
Because demolition is a by right activity. It doesn't require an application for development to be filed to the zoning board or to the planning board.
If it's, can you clarify, demolition is permitted if it's listed as a historic site?
What is by right? What's a by right?
By right means that you can do it as of right without seeking or receiving any
permission.
approval from any.
Just allowed to.
Board approval required to demolish a house, so the fact that it's listed in the master plan as a.
If it's listed in the master plan, not if it's listed in the historic.
If it's designated. Once it goes through the designation
Designated.
process, then it is subject to.
So
additional-
listing it in the master plan as a property of interest, something that is, establishes it as something just that much, but it would have to be by zoning ordinance.
Exactly.
So beyond just the master plan to create any
afford that level of protection or the
protection
additional
from demolition.
designation. Correct.
So
Does that make sense? You look skeptical?
Yeah. So by right, you can demolish a house that's been identified, but you can't change it without getting permission?
So you can, like demolition is considered a by right activity because that's not subject to zoning. There's no like zoning issue. Zoning impacts when, say, somebody wants to do an addition or do an expansion of a house, get too close to the setback line and deviate from the requirements. That's where the zoning board
Zoning
needs
is
to
for
weigh
an
in.
improvement.
Right, for improvements.
Preservation would have to be for
Exactly.
demolition. And if it's not preserved, if it's just identified as something that is a site of interest.
This
It's
is,
not
you have to think about, the
preserved.
historic preservation plan element is an aspirational list. This is what we'd like to see, or this is what we'd like to think about designating as historic. But it's not taking formal action to protect those things at this time. That's what the designation process will do, or would do.
But if the house is in one of the designated districts, then you can't demolish it.
Correct.
And Graham, just.
Could I just, oh, I'm sorry.
Let's let Srini ask the
Yeah,
question, and then you
that's
can ask the
fine.
follow-up to that one. Yeah,
Go
go ahead.
So is there, do you have a rough sense on how many properties have been listed or as potential of interest and
Mhm.
not yet been designated?
In the current master plan, yes, I have that, it's on like the next slide.
Oh.
Which you've got.
Teacher's
You're
pet.
reading
Great,
it.
let David ask, do you
I
have a follow-up
appreciate
question?
it. You're
Yeah,
following my flow.
that's good. Great, go ahead,
A
David.
follow-up to Deborah's question.
Yes,
There's the district
yes,
where the house can be torn down if the house itself has, or the building itself hasn't been designated specifically. Okay,
yeah, it depends on how the district is listed, or,
okay.
Some districts include every block and lot within this area. Others do it kind of by property, so yeah, it depends on how it's done.
Thank you.
Okay. Nice.
Can I clarify that?
Yes.
HPC, is it designated or you're in a historic district and it's non-designated? So you have two, you might have a whole
Yes.
district, but how we do this is it's designated or it's an undesignated property, but it's in the historic district.
That's correct, yeah, and the.
On a block by block, or lot by lot case.
The nomenclature, I think, is it's within a district, when you do district designations, you identify different types of structures within the district. Because a district, you want to identify a cohesive neighborhood of areas, but you're going to have a 1950s Rambler that somebody built in the middle of this district surrounded by 1920s homes. So that house may be within the district, but that's not, then we create classifications of things. We have contributing structures, which are everybody who's from the period of the district, and then we have what are called non-contributing structures, which is this 50s Rambler that doesn't fit in with everybody else. That's what Ms. Canfield is referring to, would be this difference between a contributing structure and non-contributing structure.
And it's designated both at the national level, state level, town level?
The designation process that we're talking about here is just the local Milburn Township designation process. Any property that's listed on the national or state register is not subject to these protections if it's not within the local. The local designation only applies to those that have gone through the local process. Any other questions before everybody clear things up? So the next slide. This is where I have the numbers for you. Okay, so next I kind of wanted to just then show how does this flow kind of work for these applications for development in the review. So first we have the application gets filed, and then I wanted to add our new DRC review because it's a new entity this year here in the township. After the application filing, the DRC would then review the application. That's site plan and major subdivisions only. And then after that meeting, that initial application review happens. That's when the identification that this property is identified in the master plan as a potential historic property. We need to send a copy of the application to the HPC for them to take a look at that. And then I have a couple of explanatory steps below. So the administrative referral is made when the application is deemed complete, or then scheduled for a hearing before the planning board or zoning board. And a copy of the application is provided over to the HPC. It's important to note that this state law allows for a lot of flexibility in this process. So the second bullet is important. Failure to refer the application or failure by the HPC to provide testimony or written report does not invalidate any hearing or proceeding. So the application keeps going. And that's because there are set timeframes for applications. There's 45 days to determine to complete. There's a 90-day period for you to review the application and make a ruling on. There's different timelines. So the application has to continue moving through its process, but the HPC is provided an opportunity to review the application. And then the third bullet.
Can I just sort of paraphrase that
Yes,
just to make
yes.
sure I understand? So if the owner chooses to submit an application to do something, but the township, the boards, the different committees don't act on it, it doesn't penalize that owner. Their process will still move forward.
Correct,
Even
correct.
if the board hasn't yet reviewed
Mhm,
and commented and
mhm,
okay.
Yeah, and it's important to note too that referral of the application over to the HPC is not compulsory in this process.
Right.
So the applicant doesn't have to go. The HPC, their jurisdictional responsibility within the municipal land use laws for them to intake the application, review it, and then issue a report to this body.
Great.
They don't have to make the homeowner doesn't have to go there. There's nothing stipulated in that process. Now, it can help the process. In a lot of communities and communities that I've worked in previously, we like to show folks that you kind of get the services of a panel of architects and designers to look at your project and tell them, give some insight. I've seen a lot of successful outcomes on that process, where we've had porches proposed and somebody found a historic photo on the HPC and showed that photo and said, really, you should make that porch deeper. And they needed a greater variance, but the HPC supported that. And then the zoning board wound up approving it because it was more historically appropriate or contextually appropriate. So there's good processes and good outcomes that can happen through this.
Thanks.
So the third bullet point is, Serena, this is answering your question. So I went through and just wanted to quantify this for everybody. There are 472 locally landmark properties existing within the township and 66 additional identified properties. And the 472 and the 66 are all listed in the 1991 Historic Preservation Element.
So the 66 could be demolished or could not be demolished.
The 66 have not yet been designated, so they have no protection at this
There's no.
point. Correct. And the 66 number is actually less than 1991. I did have to remove a few that we've lost some. Don't know the exact number, but there have been some demolitions. So I just wanted to underscore that, this review requirement is existing for a significant number of properties within the township at this time already. Yes.
When you say locally landmark, can you explain?
Sure. So local landmark, that's the terminology that's used for properties that have gone through a designation process. Those 472, those are properties within Short Hills Park and the Wyoming Historic Districts. So those properties have already gone through the designation process and are protected by from demolition or other changes are subject to review by the HPC.
So they're contributing properties.
Not all of them are contributing properties within that district. Some are not contributing.
So,
There's 472 that they're listed in the plan.
okay, so of the 472, there is a subset that forms the contributing properties.
Correct. Yes. Okay. And then shifting gears over to the planning board or zoning board hearing, I just wanted to provide some information as to what happens with the HPC commentary. So the HPC provides either in-person testimony, so an HPC representative can appear at the planning board meeting or the zoning board meeting and provide verbal testimony on an application, or they provide a written report on the application to the planning board or zoning board. It's the responsibility of the planning board or the zoning board to consider the comments from the HPC. And the planning board or zoning board has the ability to either accept them, they can modify the comments, or they can reject the comments that are provided. So the comments are non-binding, they are advisory, and it's the responsibility of the land use boards to adjudicate those comments and determine as they see fit. Does anyone have any questions on this process? Yes.
Graham, could you just clarify also the process of why HPC doesn't do 66 reports? So can you kind of, because I think that's the financial piece and why it's done based on when it comes in front. Like, in other words, can you run through that just a little bit about why we're not designating these properties
Oh, sure. Yeah,
every
sure.
week? You know what I mean, we're trying,
Yes,
or
yes.
doing a report.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So the nomination report process is, there's a lot to it. There's a lot of research required, a lot of historic survey that needs to be done. It's an intensive process to go through and formulate a nomination report to begin a designation process. So it is difficult to go through and nominate and designate properties. Typically, municipalities try and make availability, apply for grants to fund that exercise. But again, it's a difficult process. So this way, the municipal land use law has essentially created this avenue just to review significant changes or major applications that are filed for properties.
And if I can just add to that, the element is actually just a guidance or a list of properties from the Dixon survey of 1978, 79. Also then the 91 element of the master plan that's currently in existence. And then also properties from the Historic Society that are believed to have some historic significance, but were not at that point put into any district or anything during the 78, when I don't remember what year it was that.
The Gibson survey, I think, was 78.
It was 78, but when we were the Wyoming and the.
Oh, that was 1988.
88.
But those two districts were designated.
So these are all properties that had been identified some time ago. So it's not like anybody's added, any new properties. And with that, as Graham said, some of them they don't even exist anymore. And out of these properties, we don't even know that they could even be designated because they've been worked on multiple times, or it no longer, be deemed historic. But without doing a report, there's no way of doing that.
Right. No, and I've seen, I've been a part of historic surveys or nomination report preparation or writing that we've done the research and it didn't pass muster. It didn't meet the criteria, it didn't rise to the level of, meeting that criteria and warranting a designation process. So, you never really know the outcome until you go through and do the research on the property and see what's changed or what's happened.
Ms. Canfield, do you happen to know how many of these have been torn down, what that 66 number nets to?
I don't know the exact number because, again, we really haven't driven in to see how many of them still exist or could even be designated. So I don't have a number, but we could get
And then
that.
further to that point too, and just to help answer your question, there are even cases where the building may still exist, but it's important to remember that by right, as we said, modifications to a property are not subject to review. So you could have a property that's still standing, but all the historic wood siding's gone, the windows have been replaced with new casement windows, and it's lost all of its historic value. So it's wouldn't even be warrant, preservation at this point. So.
Thank you.
So again, if I can just say that this is just a guide of these historic pieces that have been compiled together. And now we're saying, we need to put them on the element of the master plan so we can see if they are capable of being designated or not designated.
And I have just 2 more slides, so I know this is some good stuff, but hopefully it's been some good background and some kind of education for you all. So the next slide. So now kind of shifting gears, and just how did we get to where we are at this point? So late last year, the Historic Preservation Commission transmitted a draft of the historic preservation element to you all, to this board. This body elected to send it to an advisory subcommittee. Thanks you to Mr. Halpert and Ms. Neves for your participation on the subcommittee. And so, the subcommittee met and we had some really robust, good conversations. At the whole time we were discussing, I wanted to give you kind of this presentation to help us, but I'm glad that we could do that now, and hopefully that's kind of informed our whole process and it's come full circle. So those discussions yielded 6 recommendations, which are listed here before you on this slide. And I just wanted to touch through these, and the memo from the subcommittee has been shared out to the full planning board and has also been posted to the website. So just in high-level summary, the first recommendation is from the committee, and feel free, committee members, to jump in and provide any additional language or comments, is to supplement the community outreach and engagement of the plan element, to do a little bit of post it online, have another public meeting, have a comment period to collect, email correspondences, let folks write in and give some feedback. Just a little bit more of an opportunity for the public to provide some responses before we have the public hearing formally here at the planning board. The second is to provide a little bit more detailed methodology and selection criteria for the historic preservation resource identification, which kind of piggybacks on Ms. Canfield's comments. And I did actually meet with Mr. Ross earlier this week. And it was valuable also for me to hear, because I did not have the benefit of this, to hear that all the properties that are in the draft before you were part of the Gibson survey done in 1978, were in the 1991 preservation plan element, or part of the Historical Society's walking tours, which are published guides. So these are existing historic resources, but just want to clarify that process and make sure the public understands that there's been survey work previously done to identify these properties. The third item is to provide a little bit more information on costs of historic preservation. There is some discussion within the existing draft with respect to challenges for the township, with respect to paying for survey work or other costs associated with historic preservation. The committee was interested in adding some additional language, just that for property owners, there's maybe a cost associated with this. Now, in the plan, this is a policy document. This isn't answering the question. This isn't quantifying the issue. It's just putting it on record and saying, yes, there may be some challenges. There may be, material challenges, functional challenges. You can't match historic wood. Just putting on record that there are challenges with historic preservation with respect to feasibility. So that's all that is kind of identifying. And there is a challenges section within the plan that we can insert this language. The fourth is to detail the benefits of historic preservation for homeowners. So kind of expound upon that a little bit and show the value of historic preservation and how it can have a net positive impact on property values and other things according to some research that is out there. The fifth is to evaluate the threshold of review for modifications to residential properties that have been designated. And this kind of gets
Nicely done.
This gets to, so when a property goes through and then is designated and subject to review by the HPC, what is the threshold for review of certain modifications? For example, in some communities I've seen, they review, a light fixture on a front porch. Do we want to review every door light fixture? Probably, this is an opportunity for us to make sure that we're being correct and evaluating what is the historic fabric of the building and not, making this an onerous process for a property owner. So just a policy statement that we should look at that and think about that as this document moves forward. And then the last one is to kind of expound upon the language in the plan with respect to its discussion about the land use element, and just talk about balancing economic development, sustainability, and historic preservation, and how those three things may be pulling in opposite directions, but how we can find opportunities for synergy between those three, and see how we can do that, and just create some language that is aspirational, that we should try and find a solution to balance those three kind of competing interests. So a quick summary of our committee, but if you guys want to chime in or add any more.
I wanted to ask,
Yes.
I know where you began this slide was talking about, late last year, the Historic
Yes.
Commission gave, a
Yes,
draft
yes,
of the
yes.
plan
Mhm,
element.
mhm.
They worked, prior to that on developing it, there was a decision made.
That's correct.
The planning board did not necessarily go to Historic Commission and say, can you please, look at what we have and revise it. It came to the planning board.
Mhm, mhm.
And I think in conjunction with the township committees providing funding, or I don't exactly, I don't know because it was prior to coming to us, but I don't know if you have any of that context to sort of set the stage for how we got to the point where we
I,
received it.
unfortunately, I don't have the
You don't
benefit of
have
that, but what I do want to stress to this body is that, as I mentioned at the top of this meeting, this is your document to
Right.
own. And that's why this exercise is important, because this board needs to feel comfortable adopting this document. And that's why reviewing these comments and, making it your own, and kind of inserting some of these comments for the planning board to make it their document is important.
Yeah.
This is a valuable exercise.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and I wanted to touch on,
Sure.
you talked about an item B, exactly, sort of the potentially opportunity to include language on it, maybe being more onerous or costing more for the owners of the homes
Mm-hmm.
if they are in a designated property to do the applications. Maybe it's a slower process because they're waiting for additional review, although you did indicate that, the timeframe
Right.
shouldn't be held up more,
Mhm.
but appearing before more boards or having to speak. I think the reason that it would be appropriate at least to include something to that effect is because we do talk about the improved value,
Right.
the benefit.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's only fair to talk about a
Absolutely.
trade-off
Mhm.
in terms of citing that information in the context.
Yep.
And then I just wanted to thank you on item E, talking about sort of the threshold and what
Yes.
items. I think that was helpful for me to hear you
Yes,
say,
yes,
so
yes.
thank you on that.
Mhm. Yeah, one of the big things, which, a lot of folks don't understand, but on that point, designated properties, changes that are not subject to public view
Mhm.
can be done as of right. So if you want to do a deck on the back of your house, you're going to do a sunroom on the back of your historic home, you can do that without having to appear
So
before
long as you
anybody.
don't
Right.
go over your floor area ratio.
Right, yeah, that's subject to those other provisions, exactly. So there is flexibility within there, but we should evaluate opportunities for additional flexibility for these property owners too,
Okay.
while making sure we respect historic resources too.
Thank you, that's good. Does
Yes.
anybody have any questions or comments on this?
Yes.
So Jeff?
Does a homeowner have the ability, if they are on the list of designated properties are contributing, have the ability to petition to withdraw from the list, and how would that be considered?
So that would have to be a change done by ordinance, and that would be, a direct appeal, I think, to the governing body to kind of start that process. Again, it is an interesting question because we do even have some designated properties or listed properties in the plan element that haven't gotten designated yet, that are no longer there. So like, for example, you have a property that's been subdivided or torn down, it's still listed, the block and lot is still listed in the plan element. Do we send that for review? So it is a question, and that's why this document is important to adopt, because you're kind of doing the housekeeping a little bit. You're going through and saying, okay, well, these 6 got torn down, they shouldn't be in this plan anymore. We shouldn't, but right now they still are. So this is some of that housekeeping exercise. And if there is a homeowner that wants out of the process, that would be a conversation that they would have to have with the governing body.
Because some of the homes have been modified to such a degree that they don't retain
Sure.
any historic character, and by either legal or illegal means, it's taken
Right.
place.
And that's why it's important also to think about this threshold for review in context of contributing versus non-contributing structures within a district. I'll go back to my 1950s Rambler, because that just kind of keeps happening. But so if you have your home of 1920s historic properties, the changes to that 1950s house, don't necessarily need to be the same as the 1920s houses, because it's not the same type of house. So maybe the review for a non-contributing structure is a lower threshold, or they just need to make sure they kind of don't overpower the neighborhood, or don't look too out of character, but kind of just keep some changes more in context, for example. And thinking about policy choices and the way that we write the ordinances to respect that process too. So.
Other questions?
Any other questions?
Your last slide.
This is the last slide, I promise. Okay, so just kind of a process, like where we are now and where do we go from here. So tonight, June 18th, full planning board is to review the comment memo from your committee and determine which of the comments you'd like to transmit over to the Historic Preservation Commission for consideration. So, this is the time, I think, for you all to kind of go through your committee's work and see if there's agreement, consensus on these items. And then they'll go over to the HPC. Next, the HPC will consider those requested revisions. We'll, work to conduct public outreach if needed, and then proceed with other document changes as directed. And then later, the revised historic preservation, I'm not committing to any time limits here, because I'm not sure how long this will take, but Then later, the revised historic preservation element will come back to this body for that public hearing and final adoption. And you can either adopt it as presented, or this board could further amend the document pursuant to the public hearing as well. And then I just wanted to add that note at the bottom, just so everybody's aware, the 1991 historic preservation element of the master plan is still in effect throughout this entire process, and that remains the document that has been adopted by this board.
Thank you. Questions? Go ahead.
Can I ask a question? So we're looking at, we possibly, identifying Short Hills Village and then downtown, as potential districts,
Mhm.
correct? So given the development that's coming our way, what impact does a historic district have on new development in terms of size and design and that kind of thing?
So I think what's important is, and this kind of jumps way back to the beginning of my presentation, where we talked about zoning, and that zoning has the ability to regulate historic sites and districts. It's important to remember that historic zoning is an overlay and sits on top of base level bulk zoning. So those regulations remain in place. The historic regulations on top don't determine size, don't determine height, don't determine those setbacks. They're going to determine, windows. They're going to determine, siding or other material finishes, or can determine other things. They create a review component for things above and beyond bulk and height and those types of things. So that is separate and apart. What it does do, and I want to make sure that we distinguish, because we have some conflation of terminology I find in a lot of this process, is nothing is a historic district yet. I don't like to use the word historic district with respect to what's identified in the plan element. These are the terminology that I used when I wrote one of this in my last position was potential historic resource areas. That's what's in this plan, are potential historic resource areas. They're not a district, they're not a landmark, they're not that yet. And because it's a potential historic resource, if an application for development is filed for a property downtown or Short Hills Park or somewhere else, the HPC is availed the opportunity to review that and see what's happening to that historic resource and give comments to this board on those changes. And again, those are non-binding comments. It's just information for this board to be aware of as it considers the large application. Okay.
More questions? Okay. Thank you,
You're welcome.
first of all. Don't go too far. You may sit down if that's more comfortable.
No, that's okay.
I printed out a copy of the memorandum. Do we have copies for everybody, or do people have copies?
I have
or at least that we could
copies.
share?
We have
I have it, we can share if we need to, yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Do you have yours?
All right, we can, and just to reference, I'm talking about the memorandum that Graham referenced, that the second to last slide basically highlights the 6, recommendations, which I think my suggestion is that we just go through them one by one now, have a quick discussion on each. If we think we need to, I guess, Ed, I look to you, but if we need to have a vote on how to react to maybe one individual at a time, or if we're of like mind, then maybe we'll do it as a bulk action.
Could I just make, I
Yes.
just wanted to, as HPC wants to thank the task force for actually taking this on and really looking at this. I think it's an education not only for the planning board, but also the public to take a look at what the element really is. And this is, I just want to thank you guys for taking the time to come up with these things.
I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. That's nicely said. And I think we'd be remiss not to sort of, the planner in me, from a professional standpoint, every 10 years, as the planning board, we are responsible to revisit our master plan and dust it off and look and make sure it's speaking to what we want from our community and where we want it to go. It is an aspirational document, like you mentioned, but some elements get a closer look than others at times. And so in this case, right, it's really been since 91, since it's really been
31 years, yeah. 31 years.
Let's not count. So thank you. That said, I think that's
91 was an amendment.
91 was the most recent amendment, yeah. So here we are with an opportunity to look and bring it to a point where we feel is appropriate and comfortable to move our town forward. So thank you. With respect to A, the the desire for potentially more community outreach and engagement. I think the subcommittee made some good recommendations on just making sure the outreach effort really is more broad. I know there were 2 meetings that were open to the public, as it stated, the Milburn Historic Preservation Commission, open the meeting. They published their, the agenda. It would have been inclusive, so members of the community had opportunity to. But the subcommittee of the planning board has said, a potential additional outreach, specifically an information session, was what was suggested. Anybody have thoughts on whether we would still like to send that recommendation to the HPC? Maybe outreach effort. Go ahead,
I
yes.
just wanna rely on Graham a little bit here. So he has all the experience, he's gone through this process before, and I feel like that is one of the biggest things that we need to do to make sure the public actually is in agreement with what we do with the element. So I think that we should have another session of outreach. It always comes to a head when it comes to the planning board or the TC, and that's when people get notified about it, really. And so I think a little bit more outreach needs to be done, and if you're in agreement with that, that's great.
One of the things too that we heard, Michael, you spoke of it last night, which I think is great. Michael's the representative liaison to the CETA, is in April for Founder's Day. CETA is having walking tours with a.
That's right.
Can you explain what CETA is? For
Yes,
It's
go ahead,
the,
Michael.
Cultural Engagement, Diversity and Arts Committee.
Great, thank you.
So they, amongst other things, they sponsors their Founding Day. We had that last year, and one of the activities on Founding Day are historical walking tours.
In April.
April 22nd.
April, so I
So
think
just to make sure I'm fully understanding, are you considering leveraging some of that community outreach with potentially a discussion of this?
I think
just
that
wanna
would be
make
a
sure.
great idea to, I think it would be a wonderful idea if we have the historic walking tours, the Historical Society put that all together. I think maybe there might be a way to leverage that as well,
Okay.
so that people can see what it is exactly we're talking about.
Timeline in that would work nicely because May is Historic Preservation Month. It'd be nice to have our public hearing adopted in May. Would be great.
Okay,
Just a little plug.
who is, on behalf of the planning board, would the next step be, just wanna make sure I'm talking to
Sure,
the right
sure.
person, does this become like Eileen's responsibility as our secretary and taking notes to document the response back, or is it you as the planner?
So I think,
Just wanna make sure I'm
I
understanding.
think my recommendation would be that perhaps the planning board have their subcommittee members
Okay.
work to kind of message this back to the HPC, and
Got it.
perhaps we could look to have a joint meeting with our planning board subcommittee members, to kind of coordinate, scheduling of this information session and, just kind of working out whatever the recommendations are, just so that there is a connection between the two boards and that, things don't happen independently and we're constantly referring back.
Great, I think that's a great recommendation. Okay, so subsequent to this meeting, the subcommittee members would kind of take what we've talked about, digest it,
Mhm.
put it in a quick, couple bullets or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I can help
couple
facilitate
paragraphs, you could help
official
facilitate that,
communication.
and that would then be transmitted back to
Mhm.
the HPC. Okay,
Mhm.
thanks, I just want to make sure we all know the process. I think that's reasonable. I think we can move on to item B
Mhm.
then. And we'll sort of take an action at the end.
Sure.
Making sure that we're all improved. Okay, so item B was detailed methodology and selection criteria for the historic preservation resource identification. And what was specifically noted, that's within section 6.2. It's previously been identified by the HPC, the Historical Preservation Element Working Group, and local stakeholders with expertise. So the recommendation here this was potentially including that language, whether it's a couple sentences or what, to indicate that, yes, sometimes there are more costs to the owners of the houses, and just making sure that that's included within this element, acknowledging that, yes, there are, it's sort of kind of talked, and there were tables talking about the benefits to the community,
Well, I think
economic
this,
benefits.
if I could just clarify
Please
here,
do,
this
yeah.
section B talks specifically about what properties are in here and why did we pick these properties and how did these wind up in the plan. So it looks to just expand section 6.2
Mhm.
to reference the materials that Ms. Canfield had talked about,
Gotcha.
the Gibson survey, the Historical Society's walking tours, all the properties from the 1991 plan element, just to kind of expand on that and say, these are the properties that are in
How they
this
got
plan
there,
element,
yeah.
how they got here.
Okay.
I think, we just want to make sure that there's clarity for the public that, there's backing to this. These properties have long been known in the community as historic properties. And we just want to put that out there and make sure that folks understand that's why these properties are listed.
Thank
So that's
you.
that point. Yeah, I think you were jumping ahead to the next
I
one.
think you're right. Seeing costs, yes, okay, so for B, it's just providing the further detail as you just
Exactly.
noted.
And does it do that ultimately?
So we had a conversation, I had a conversation with Mr. Ross, who supported the HPC in writing this, and he's the one that has the benefit of, all this detailed information. So he and I can work in tandem to incorporate that additional language, so that's detailed and spelled out in the language.
I just have a question back.
Sure.
to B. I was just you were talking about, it seemed as though you're only talking about existing properties, but then there was conversation about new properties. So I'm kind of.
Sure, yeah, I can help clarify that. So the 1991 Historic Preservation Plan element that's currently adopted, that's the, 400 some odd
Right.
locally landmarked and 66 further identified that have not yet been designated. So now the new plan element that we have draft before you includes those properties. And then in addition, I think it was 1978, was the Gibson survey. A lot of communities did this. In Montclair was in 1981. The Junior League did a preservation survey. A lot of groups in that time period went out and did historic surveys of properties within the township. So there's a catalog of Milburn properties from 1978 that looked at all historic properties. So the intent is to take that detailed work and put that in the plan element as, we have a set of properties that were identified as historic and surveyed at that time. So that's one component. And then the second component is the Historical Society has these walking tours that identify significant properties. And that would be the second
That
set.
are not part of.
Those
would be
two, the Gibson survey and the historical walking tours, those are not listed in the 91 version of the plan.
Right, so the detailing the methodology.
Exactly
then
right.
apply to both, which is,
Yes.
that was really my question.
Thanks. Okay. And I think that makes sense, just to be further describing sort of the methodology of how we got to where we got. So
Exactly.
I think that would benefit the plan element. C was the costs, that's what I was jumping the gun into, describing a little bit more of the supplemental discussion of, the economic challenges, as you phrased. Just to sort of counter the benefits, but some of the costs too, to provide that context. Yes, Don.
And also with this one, with the costs, there are grants available,
Mhm,
right?
that's
And
correct.
It might be good to inform the public that, yes, even if you are designated as an historic site, that you can get money that will
That is correct.
completely offset what you actually have to pay to do anything. with it. So,
Mhm. Yeah, there are easement programs or other programs that the state administers and other entities at the state level. So
Great, and that would be, again, you would work with Barton or
Yes, yeah, we
somebody
can
to sort of
certainly-
find that language and build off of whether
Yes.
it's nicely done. Okay, I find that reasonable as well. Okay, great.
do you have a question?
This is actually stepping back to B. Of the 472 properties that were designated,
Mhm.
so there exists paperwork that essentially says why each of them is on the list.
I'd have to go back to the archives from 1988. That was done by ordinance in 1988. I'm sure that, there was a process that went through and, different information from that time. But
Like architect
Mhm.
or if it was a divided property, so then that's your contributing versus non-contributing. So a lot of the historic designated houses have larger properties where there might be one or four other houses on the original land of the existing designated house or contributing house. So those things are all listed when it was built, what year it was built, if it was part of the, land of a designated property. So it just goes into a lot more detail, of, how the district was formed and originally where the houses were.
And the existing, that 466, they're only in those two sections? Is
it's
that
those
correct?
two sections, and then there's 3 additional individual landmarks. Hessian House, I think we just did last year,
The
right?
cemetery
Cemetery
and the parcel
and the
house.
parcel house, yes.
So
2021, actually.
Yeah, oh my gosh, yeah.
there's a house near where I live, it has a plaque on it that said it's Hartshorn House number 60 something or another. That's not designated.
No, it is.
Oh, it is.
I don't know off the top of my head, I don't
But
wanna,
if
I don't wanna.
it's not in those neighborhoods, but it could then still be a designated house, is I guess what I'm.
It would first have to be identified within this document and then subsequently.
But it doesn't have to be in those two neighborhoods necessarily.
No, yeah, no, it
Which
doesn't.
house is that one?
It's on Hobart, and you right by the train station.
That's designated. Short Hills Park.
Oh, yeah, then
That's
Oh,
what
Short
Short Hills
Hills
Park,
Park
that's
is all
part,
the way
yeah,
over
the
there.
Short
It
Hills
comes
Park
all the
comes
way
all the way
down.
down. Wyndham Road is designated.
It's
All
right
those
over
little
there.
tutors, yeah.
And do you have another?
My question actually, going off of what you had mentioned, Allison, is in the paperwork, you talked about how a larger property got subdivided and then there were non-contributing properties within it. But the main property itself, did they say it's designated because of, on page 23, there is its character association with the end. So it lists the criteria by which that was
So,
designated.
I do just wanna, two things. One is, that would be the requirement today, under the requirements. Now, I do just wanna caution, I'm not familiar with what the state statute stipulated in 1988. So, I don't know if they did require it at that time, or if they just sent in a list of properties and did it, but any future nomination or designation would have to be subject to that exact point you're talking about.
And just so you know, we did an updated survey.
Yes.
So with that updated survey, it does, the requirements were to list, maybe it was a famous architect. But you'd be surprised how many famous architects built houses in Short Hills. So again, it lists all of those things. So that was grant dollars given to us to update the survey. And with that, there were certain requirements, today's new regulations, and those were followed. So, and that's where we identified that some of these properties that were on this list are still not designated. And that's when we say the Gibson survey, and we're throwing it onto the master plan element.
Is this also only residential, or it could be, so, for example, a religious institution have been designed by a famous architect.
That's
Is that
correct.
something that would perhaps could be designated?
Yes. Yeah, commercial. Historic preservation is irrespective of property, how it's taxed or, who owns it. The value is in the public, in the building and its presentation to the public, and what the public sees.
And we do have a list in the element of the master plan that shows the properties, and you'd be surprised that how many of these properties that we would have thought are designated or not designated, and are at risk to be demolished.
Okay. Great, thank you. I think, we sort of stepped back to B, but suggest that you felt that was a helpful response, or you thought your question was, okay, great. So we'll move to item D, which is detailing the benefits of historic preservation for homeowners. So again, I could just ask an important question, is this residential or any use? And while it is any use that it could apply to, the section 1.1 summary of historic preservation benefits, provided the high level detail, benefits. The committee was recommending expanding additional references to incorporate more detailed benefits to property owners, further context on the benefits of historic preservation and the value of undertaking activities. I guess I just want to make sure there are more of them that we're calling for. Just like, is this can you clarify a little bit more on this?
I think that there is some additional research that can be, provide some more supportive language about the benefits of districting or other, things. There is some additional language that we should incorporate to explain those benefits.
Okay, and more context maybe on sort of district versus specific
Exactly.
designated properties or contributing versus non-contributing. Okay.
Question,
Right.
it's D is entitled detail the benefits of historic preservation for homeowners, should it be property owners?
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion.
Do we feel it's different for residential dwellings versus not? I guess that's
It is, functionally, just for reference for this body, different, it's hard. There are not many funding opportunities directly for individual homeowners. That's been one of the limitations and challenges that we, are going to talk about in the prior section. But like larger commercial or multifamily properties, income producing properties have tax credit advantages from the federal government if they are historically designated and do preservation work. So there's actually more financial benefits for those types of properties. So that would be good to explain, I think, in this section as well.
That's why I asked about religious institutions, but that's kind of good, but neither,
And there is some, and I'm sure Mr. Buzak may be more familiar, but there is some recent, not too long ago, case law on this where there's been some challenges by the state awarding grant money to religious facilities, and is there a line there as far as historic preservation goes? So there's been some challenges on that front as well.
So Graham, would this be the opportunity, certainly historic preservation would love to see some kind of tax credit given to residential properties. Is that something that this board could recommend?
I think, so it's important to remember that this is a policy guiding document. I want to caution this board to not get into the weeds on like tax policy development and more so just make these kind of aspirational recommendations that the township should maybe evaluate opportunities for financial incentives for properties to make these kinds of changes.
But I think that's a
But it's a
strong
great point. It is a strong
recommendation.
recommendation.
Yeah.
Has any town ever done it?
There, some communities do use tax abatement programs to allow residents a 5-year reprieve on the value of improvements. So they have a reprieve on that for 5 years. That may be an opportunity to kind of reconfigure with historic preservation, but that'd be something that we'd have to look at and see if anybody else has done that.
Any local towns or just?
I want to I'll take a look and see if I can get a better answer on that. But yeah,
And
that's
I guess
a good strategy.
the question that we're getting at is if we were to include a religious, whether a church or another religious institution in the list of properties
Right.
that we're considering, maybe district, maybe not a district. And then if it were to move in advance and have a zoning ordinance, and then come back to us and then be approved, kind of going down that list that you had put. And if this gets to the point where a religious institution is now designated historic, there could be different implications on them wanting to make improvements interior or exterior.
Interior is not subject
Not
to review.
interior, exterior.
Exterior only. And publicly visible
And
facade.
publicly visible. And that's where I think, Allison
Right,
is making the point that, and maybe we could make a recommendation that the TC would consider that in.
Yeah, and I just want to note the other local kind of funding mechanism is open space taxes. Local open space taxes are allowed to, a portion of those can be used for historic preservation. Now, I don't think that exists in this community, but some communities do have separate local open space taxes, and a portion of those can be used for historic preservation funding.
And Graham, can you just cover not-for-profit also funding that they can apply for, especially if they're in a historic property?
Oh, absolutely,
We've
yes,
seen
yeah.
that before.
Yes, yeah, the state historic trust has a number of programs. It's very interesting, there's an easement program where the trust will essentially buy the rights to a visible facade of your property and pay you financially for that. And in exchange, you promise not to do any deviating modifications to that facade for a certain number of years, for like a 30-year period of time, for example. That's an opportunity to kind of, avail to homeowners as well, so.
Great. Yes. Because this is, I'm going to come back to HPC. Can we go over what if listening to this board, what we're already really kind of doing, the minor work review, that type of thing, how the process, is that what this particular?
I think that might be something that we can work through with the planning board, the planning members of our committee here and in conversations with the HPC, just to kind of determine where that is. I think that the recommendation should stand though, that we're just, the policy recommendation that we're saying is just look at it and evaluate it. We're not recommending a decision because we don't want this document to kind of like guide and make the decision. We're not going to do that in the next, 3 months to determine what the threshold should be.
Right.
But let's revisit it and, evaluate that and make sure that it's, appropriate for homeowners, but then also appropriate to preserve historic resources. So
So the recommendations here, and I just wanna make sure because, do you have the memo in front of you?
I do.
Can you read the last sentence?
I think it got cut off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cause it says in mine,
But
but
should
should
recommend, I
recommend,
know,
and
I
then I'm
think
like, I don't know what we
something
should
got cut
recommend.
I apologize.
It's a real cliffhanger here.
No, I think that just as I just stated, I think
Yeah.
the plan element should just recommend that the threshold for review for modification should be evaluated. Just to consider sensitivities of homeowners in balance with the need for historic preservation.
And I think that makes sense, and that was kind of what you gave me, the example of like, if you're changing a light bulb, is
Right.
that the threshold?
Right.
Or, you're changing your porch,
Right.
maybe that's a threshold, and so
maybe
maybe that is.
there should be more clarity, like, oftentimes I saw a lot of fence replacements and somebody was like, I'm just doing the same wood picket fence, like, if it's
Right,
like
if
for
it's in
life, like, do we
kind,
really need to, can we speed that up and make that easier for folks? Those are some examples.
Great, so those are some things which we are, going to make a decision if we want to recommend to the subcommittee to amend that in the.
But to just incorporate that language into the
Okay.
plan.
That sounds reasonable.
Mhm.
Thoughts? Comments? Okay, thanks. The last item, which may be our biggest discussion or may not. So this is on the balancing economic development, sustainability, and historic preservation, some of the challenges and recommendations. I think this, if my reading is interpreting it correctly, it's kind of talking about the downtown of it, or the downtowns, and how pervasive or how broad we want to sort of cast the historic preservation reach,
Mhm.
given potential conflicts with other recommendations within the master plan. And so it talks about contextual design requirements more clearly for development within the township's commercial district, which recently was amended to permit development of 3 and sometimes 4-story building heights. So we, the planning board, just determined, I think that was consistent with the master plan, and the zoning was amended in our downtown to
Mhm.
permit 4 stories.
Mhm.
If a property owner chose to then build to 4 stories, that would be an improvement.
Mhm.
If that site was designated historic, that would trigger review, right?
So it's important, I
just
wanna
wanna
make
I'm
sure,
understanding
I wanna
that
make
correct.
sure, and this is kind of getting back to our application review.
Mhm.
So the way that the municipal land use law is structured for applications for development that are coming to this board, in order to avoid a situation where you have 2 approvals, so, that 4-story, the HPC denies a 4-story and you guys approve it, what do you do? It's a quagmire.
Right.
That's why the municipal land use law has this advisory role for the HPC. So the
Okay.
planning board is the ultimate adjudicator of the application, and the HPC just provides their comments to you all as the approving entity. So that you don't wind up with 2 approvals, 1 approval, 1 disapproval. And that's why this section is important, because in the master plan element, we want to contemplate some of these challenges and the push-pull that may be happening. And I think it's important, this is a section where we did talk at the subcommittee level about the Secretary of the Interior standards for treatment of historic buildings, and they have very detailed requirements, and we should just reference some of those.
Okay.
They have detailed requirements for how to do an addition to a historic building. Make sure you offset it looks different, you don't compete with the existing historic fabric. How do you build a new building next to a historic building? There's a lot of detailed requirements. So I think just referencing that in this section and saying, think about that and consider those types of requirements here in the township as we think about new construction in context of historic fabric. And then the other point that I did just want to mention, because the sustainability sections did come up with Mr. Halpert's comments, are what about incorporation of solar panels for a residential property? How's that push-pull work? And some of these sustainability features on individual homeowner properties, how do we handle those? Again, I don't want us to get too mired in answering these questions. I want us to really focus on, my suggestion to you all is to focus on identifying them as a concern, or something that we need to think about as policies are developed by the TC and as other things come down the pike. We can think about and remember, oh yeah, we have that challenge. We have to think about how are we gonna treat this? How are we gonna evaluate this ordinance? Those types of things.
Yeah, I definitely want us to, all collectively be mindful of not creating our own inconsistency within the master,
Exactly.
One speaking to one, desire and then.
And that's why
another,
I think I want us to avoid committing to a strategy in this document, because if we commit to a strategy, then we're gonna create inherent inconsistencies. So I think it's best to just highlight this as an issue. And then as you all see these ordinances and debate them, weigh consistency, you can think about these types of things.
I appreciate
If I
that.
could add some clarification. Historic preservation doesn't mean that we're against development. And just like Graham had mentioned, is it really just keeping the historic piece of that, adding a glass structure. You see many now adding very contemporary structures to very historic structures. I'm talking more buildings than residential.
Addition, right.
It's in keeping, it goes well with what's there. It's, then the building next to that, what happens? So it's really, when we say historic, we don't really want the addition to look like the original house. And it's not understood a lot, because you think historic, we want it exactly the way, it is. From the road, we'd like to identify, because it's in the survey, the facade of that house and what it represented in the period of time in which it was designated. Do you see what I'm saying? So in addition to that piece, or especially in commercial buildings, can you raise it to a 4-story, architecturally pleasing, which doesn't take away from the actual historic building? So, there's all these pieces, but somehow we end up, it has to look old. I want to clear that out of everybody's mind right now. So historic preservation is pro-development. So if we can leave it at that.
Yeah, and just in furtherance to your point, because that is exactly what the Secretary of the Interior standards say, is to do additions that differentiate and protect, the historic structure. You don't want to, there's specific direction to refrain from, replicating historic material. You don't want to do that. You want to do additions that are sensitive to that. And in furtherance to that point also, historic preservation is, innately supportive of development, because communities where you lose development around these historic buildings, you wind up having these vacant, empty, standalone historic buildings that are then kind of losing, tenant occupancy and support as a life of building. So it's important to kind of keep them supported as well.
Yes, and I think we'll need to be mindful of, you're right, how far we're going, how much we're saying, as a master plan element versus a zoning ordinance.
Exactly.
And those are two different things for two
They are.
different reasons. Okay. I think that's helpful. I think the subcommittee did a fantastic job. Thank you for sort of training them in and bringing it to this recommendation, set of recommendations. And if we as a board are able to, I guess, move on it, we would then make the recommendation back to the subcommittee to sort of formalize this per your suggestion and submit it to the HPC for their additional steps. I wanted to touch on one thing before we take action. Thank you. I think along the way you've been sort of saying, yes, Bart and I can do this, or we had some conversations, and it seems like nothing individually is a major lift, potentially including public outreach and public engagement. And I think the question was asked last time about cost and who would bear that cost, and whether that should feed into our decision as a planning board. Obviously, we're here to make recommendations. Things do have cost impacts, right? So I think you kind of characterized most of these as not huge, it's sort of textural and drafting some language and making sure and reviewing. And maybe I like the idea that was suggested of incorporating outreach into already ongoing kind of community events. So kind of piggybacking off opportunities. So I hope that would do some effort to minimize, additional cost to the community about that. Allison, I think you had offered last time to speak to, if I think you had asked if you were permitted to speak to the costs.
And I think I did, just some clarification of really what historic preservation is. I love the suggestions for that. We, review them with our board. For us, it's a great opportunity to educate. So this public outreach is a wonderful thing. We had already slated, scheduled public outreach, not necessarily on this element, except it would have been included over the past year, because we have been revising it over the past year. But COVID and various things got in the way where we weren't able to do that, but we have a subcommittee in outreach. And unfortunately, it just didn't pan out with COVID, because the minute we put it in place, then we were in lockdown. So we are just now kind of ramping up again. So we're doing a lot of unique things and also helping homeowners get through historic faster with the minor work review. You know, there's all kinds of things that will educate people on some of the myths that are out there, or that we want to designate all these properties that are on this list, because we don't know that we can. And so just, again, an education for everyone, I think. And it's a great thing. People ask me why 40 years. I don't know that answer, why it took 40 years, but what I do know now is that, you know, we've reached that point, and we need to be educated on historic preservation, especially since our town has such valuable historic resources. So, thank you for doing that.
Absolutely, thank you. So I think we would want to make a motion and second and vote to formalize this, to take the notes and the results of our discussion tonight, and then have it transmitted to the HPC. So I will make that motion to do just that.
I'll second.
Gaston? Yes.
No, there should be discussion on the motion, but I have a question. Is there timing on this? Just, you know, anybody have an idea of how much time this is going to take?
Next and later.
Thank you for using my time.
No, but I think nobody's looking to have this go on indefinitely. I think, you know, certainly we want to, you know, I know we deferred this discussion a few times from the end of the year to the first meeting, just to make sure, you know, the current planning board as it will be for this year. So I would hope this is something that we could get this memo probably within the next 2 weeks. Is that a reasonable timeframe? And give it to HBC, allow them to meet and discuss it at their, you know, the appropriate meeting. I know they only meet
Well, we
Monday.
meet February 2nd.
February
And we'll certainly
They
work
have
to
it
get
in
it to
advance
them.
of February
Great
2nd.
if we could
Absolutely.
have that before then, so then Michael can vote on it and we can get a response back.
Sure. And I think to your point, Mr. Buzak, it just, you know, for the benefit of the public record, you know, any community outreach or public outreach event will, you know, be widely noticed, I would think, to the community at large. And then the public hearing before this body, of course, would be noticed as well. So the public will be informed when this will be up for discussion again at both.
Maybe like in April, even to coincide with the CETA, the walking tours, maybe
Actually, yeah.
figuring for April.
We would have to let HBC take it and hopefully run with it, but I
Yeah.
think that's
Is
our
that reasonable?
recommendation, I think. Yeah, I think that could be reasonable.
I'm just one, so.
Yeah. I think that could be.
I'd like to make that
Take it back to your
decision, but
committee, absolutely.
I'd like to take it back to the board, that we all agree on that.
Sure.
Comfortable? Good, no, good, it's a valuable question. No, I think that was a
Next
good
and later.
clarification. Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Can we take a roll call vote? I think we can.
Can you just state the motion?
The motion was to formalize the 6 points of discussion that we had tonight, which do reflect the report that was provided by the planner, you know, adding the clarifications as we discussed, and submitting that to the historical commission.
Elsie Canfield,
Yes.
Michael Cohen,
Yes.
Maggie Miggins,
Yes.
Deborah Nevis,
Yes.
Sujata Shan,
Yes.
Srini Vijay,
Yes.
David Cosgrove,
Yes.
Gaston Halbert,
Yes.
Ed Zoll.
Yes. Thank you. No further items of business tonight. I don't have the date of our next meeting. Is it February 1st?
Yes.
Our next meeting will be February 1st. I make a motion to adjourn at 9 p.m. Do I have a second? Second. Thanks, Deborah. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Meeting adjourned. It feels so good.
No, I don't want to, 'cause it's always.
Okay.